Hello, everybody. Anin, bonjour, bonjour. I'm going to introduce myself in my language. So excited to be here with you all today. So, Anin, bonjour, bonjour, Shanese Ndishnakas, and Dobo the Gonish Nabemnang, Jacqueline Dwyer. Meti Makade Kwe, Edopokang Danjaba, Jacqueline Dwyer. So, hello, everybody. My name is Shanese Steele. I am a community member, a Afro-Indigenous person, and a staff member here at Tamarack Institute. And I'm so excited to be in conversation with you all today. As someone who is the descendant of formerly enslaved people, of displaced people, of people who found homes on these lands, and also the descendant of people who have been on these lands for thousands of years, this conversation is so important to me, to talk about this relationship between Black ancestries and land and climate and futures, because oftentimes we're not included in conversations like these. And so I think it's really important that we're creating this space to have these now, to really highlight the relationship that Black folks of African descent, have to the land, not just within the global context, but within the Canadian context, or so-called Canadian context now. So Kieran, if you'd like to move to the next slide. So we just have a land acknowledgement. So I'm coming to you right now from the traditional territory of the Mississauga, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat people here in what we now call North York or Toronto. I refer to it as Edopakong, which means the place of many trees, and that's the original Anishinaabe term for what we now call the North York region. It might sound very similar to Etobicoke, if you've heard that before, and that's the anglicized word of Edopakong. It's important for me to acknowledge my relationship to these lands, even though these aren't my people's traditional territories. My family, both my Métis and Anishinaabe family, and my Trinidadian and Grenadian and Kayak family have found safety here on these lands in many different ways. They have found justice and injustice on these lands in many different ways. They have found connection and kinship. And it's important for me to acknowledge my relationship past just a land acknowledgement that we read off of a screen, but really my relationship to these lands, even as an Indigenous person. I am a guest on the Mississauga people's land, on Haudenosaunee people's lands. And we also fall under the dish with one spoon wampum on these lands. And that is a teaching, a covenant, a treaty between Indigenous people to share these lands with each other that predates the colonial relationship that people now have with these territories. And so it's important for all of us to really take a moment and think about our relationship to the lands that we are individually on right now. Whether you're in Toronto, whether you are coming in from the Maritimes or the West Coast or the North, wherever you are, I want you to really think about what it means to be on these lands, to be connected to these lands in ways that the people that were the original caretakers of these lands might not necessarily have those relationships. And even as folks that are the descendant of formerly enslaved people, of people who have been forcibly brought to these lands, what it means to have a kinship to these lands that our ancestors have found as home, and what it means to then have that relationship with the original caretakers of these lands. And so, yeah, I just want folks to take a second, really think about that as we move forward in this conversation today, what that really means. We can go to the next slide. We also have an African ancestral acknowledgement, and I touched a little bit on that in my land acknowledgement there. But it's important for us to acknowledge those of our ancestors who came here as internal migrants, as displaced people, even if we have ancestors who came here as settlers, those who came involuntarily, or those who were brought through as refugees or through the transatlantic slave trade, and what relationship we have to those ancestors and how we pay tribute to those ancestors and the lives that they lived and the resiliency that they showed in the ways in which we are now able to be here today. And so it's very important that we acknowledge this, not just in our commitment to contributing to dismantling systemic anti-Black racism, but also in our relationship to each other on these lands. Many of us come from different places. around the globe and what it means to be Black people, African descended people on these lands and our relationship to our ancestors. So today we have a partnership, the Tamarack Institute. We're really big on partnering with community members, community organizations, and today we are partnering with Black Eco Bloom. And I would like to invite Tyjana to introduce Black Eco Bloom and a bit about the organization because it's such an honor to be able to partner with them in this conversation today.
Hi, everyone. I just want to start by saying I'm so grateful to be in this space, and I'm really grateful to be able to have this conversation. It's very near and dear to my heart and the work that we do at Black Eco Bloom. So to introduce myself, I'm Tyjana. I'm the co-founder and executive director of Black Eco Bloom. My pronouns are she, her. I am joining from Calgary or Mohkinstsis in the Treaty 7 territory here in Alberta. And yeah, I guess I'll tell you a little bit about Black Eco Bloom. So Black Eco Bloom is a sustainable development organization that focuses on supporting Black women to enter the environmental sector, Black women and gender diverse individuals. And we really started out with an idea of how important it is to have representation in the environmental sector. Myself and my co-founder, we kind of grew BEB out of our own experiences. But as the years have gone by, we've grown and we've changed our mission to not only focus on representation, but also to focus on supporting Black communities to adapt to climate change, community training, networking and outreach, and being able to bring our community to different spaces like within Canada and in the global space. And we focus on the perspectives of African individuals, Caribbean individuals, Black Canadians, just like the diaspora as a whole, just to bring our communities together and kind of have a conversation that we feel has been missing from this sector. So being able to have this conversation about like our ancestries and our connection to the land and how that connection to the land has been subverted through various forms of oppression, I think it's really important and really needed. So I'm really excited to have been able to partner with Tamarack, to work with Shanese and Kieran on this. It's really important to me and really special. So I'm excited. Thank you.
So we are now going to have the opportunity to hear a story. When we talked about creating this space and this event, we had talked about wanting to start it in a way that felt rooted and connected in who we are and in our relationships. And storytelling is such an important part of community, especially when we're thinking of those of us who are from communities where storytelling not only shapes our communities, but are ways in which we pass on teachings and lessons and the histories of our people and our communities. So I would like to introduce our speaker, our storyteller. Djenabé is a Toronto-born Haitian Canadian photographer, curator, and writer. Wow, that's a lot. Amazing. Keen on creating space for imagination and sparking dialogues that examine contemporary anthropological philosophies. And so I really want us all to come into this space, take a deep breath, breathe, and get ready for a very powerful story that we're about to be told and shared with us. Djenabé, I'd like to pass it on to you.
Hello and good afternoon, everybody. I'm really honored and excited to be here. And I'm just going to share my screen really quickly so I can get this presentation and images to you. Alrighty, let me know if you can see my screen.
Looks good.
Okay, sweet. Alrighty. So yes, and thank you for the introduction, Shanese. My name is Djenabé, and I will be basically sharing a story with you from an essay that I wrote that was inspired by a photography project that I have been working on for a couple years, taking my time with that process. And it's titled New Magic, and it's basically exploring the tarot cards and reimagining those figures as Afro-Caribbean deities, symbologies, and oral histories. So today I'll be sharing a story from one of those images, and that is the story about Xaymaca, which is the Indigenous name of Jamaica. as we know it today, and Xaymaca translates to the land of wood and water. So I'm going to set the mood a little bit. It's like light music playing, and please join me on this journey. High above, in the blue mountains of Xaymaca, lurked the outlaws of stolen lands, hidden away amongst the abundant tropical foliage, with a bird's eye view of the rivers and ports. The descendants of the Akan, Igbo, Arawak, and Taino tribes foraged for freedom. Enslaved Africans and indigenous tribes coalesced in remote regions of the mountain, surviving with subsistence farming and guerrilla tactics. They raided the sugarcane plantations and evoked uprisings, recruited more runaways, and some of these runaways were the Indian indentured servants bearing Hindu rituals and the ganja flower. Pirates, privateers, planters, African laborers, indentured servants, and runaway maroon mountaineers alike populated the island nation of Xaymaca. In 1494, the Spanish invaded and founded Port Royal, which was the epicenter of commerce in the Caribbean Sea, also known as a popular den of drunkenness and sin, where the British and the Dutch pirates swarmed and taunted and pillaged the Spanish treasure fleets, and sometimes whole villages. Prior to Spanish settlement and British rule, the indigenous people called this port Caguaya Bay. It was a notable destination for their fishing expeditions. Following the 2-century-long Spanish rule of Jamaica was the British invasion of 1655, which later led to the British Maroon Wars that lasted for a century. Port Royal eventually became the most economically successful port in the English colonies and an infamous Sodom of the New World, home to pirates, artisans, merchants, and tavern keepers. The 51-acre town quickly accumulated a diverse population of 6,500 people traveling as far as Madagascar. So how could those sweet stalks of sugarcane inspire such a sinister roster of visitors? Some may say greed, and others may think power is the culprit, but pirates surely blame it on the rum. Port Royal became quite a wealthy town where bartering was replaced with the exchange of silver coins, and long before New York City became a popular trading post founded by the Dutch in 1624 to 26 as New Amsterdam, Port Royal was a burgeoning metropolis with an exotic mix of residents, industries, and natural resources. Yet, still, the destruction and debauchery that took place at Port Royal became so unruly that an Anti-Piracy Act was passed in 1687 by Lieutenant Governor and reformed pirate Henry Morgan. This happened just 1 year before he died, and his casket was swallowed by the 1692 earthquake and subsequent tsunami that liquefied and sunk the thin 18-mile-long sand spit that Port Royal was built on into a horrifying pressurized quicksand. And to this day, they still cannot find that casket. Following this Anti-Piracy Act, Port Royal started to be recognized as a place where pirates were imprisoned or executed. The newly arrived Africans from the Ashanti Kingdom came to Jamaica with a knack for combat and a hunger for freedom. Following a major plantation uprising in 1690, the Leeward and Windward Maroon communities were established under the leadership of Queen Nanny and Cudjoe. Legends state that they were a fearsome duo who led the Maroons in the First British Maroon War. Their victory granted them freedom and more than 2,000 acres of land in the St. Elizabeth, Trelawney, and Portland parishes. Queen Nanny was said to have supernatural powers that let her catch bullets and a deep relationship with ancestral entities through the spiritual practice of obia. She was honored as the first female national hero of Jamaica, and today she can be found on the $500 banknote. Following the 1739 treaties that featured a clause requiring the Windward and Leeward Maroons to support the colonists, some Maroon communities, approximately 600 men, women, and children, were later exiled from Jamaica and deported to Nova Scotia in 1796. The commander-in-chief of the British in Halifax was Edward Augustus, Duke of Kent, later on to be known as the father of Queen Victoria. He and Governor Wentworth had the Maroons rebuild the Halifax citadel and form a Maroon militia to ward off French invasion of Canada. After several unbearable winters, many of the Maroons and Loyalists from the American Revolutionary War were sent off to live in Freetown, Sierra Leone. The ones who stayed were faced with a peculiar kind of freedom, one that presented them with segregation, financial disparities, and evictions from promised lands of the monarch. And that is the end of, well, not quite the end. Those were excerpts from an essay, again, that I had wrote, and the essay is titled Port Royal and the 400-Year War. And yeah, I wanted to share this quote by Cole Arthur Riley from Black Liturgies, Prayers, Meditations for Staying Human. And also just some reflections of kind of the journey from a place like Xaymaca into Canada, and the pathway of extraction and eviction and displacement, and the contemporary dilemmas even now of gentrification, and Afro-Caribbean communities in Canada that are still facing this kind of perpetual geocultural homelessness, and how there remains a lack of dignified spaces for our communities to settle and grow roots as Black bodies in Canada, and the socioeconomic climate and how we navigate that. And in some ways still grapple with that peculiar kind of freedom that our ancestors had access to, one that alienates us from belonging and ownership, and strains our relationship to the lands that we hope to call home. But I believe we can all access great healing and insight through cultivating these very conversations, creating spaces to share oral histories and ancestral wisdoms, and enlivening our multicultural Canadian population through doing so, and building a future where we honor our ecosystems and let the dandelions grow unkempt and wild in our gardens for a while, because the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe peoples harvested them as medicine and famine food. And yeah, those are some of my reflections on that. And thank you again so much for having me share these stories and these thoughts. And I really look forward to this conversation. And I'll pass it back to you, Shanese. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Djenabé. Wow. As someone who is also from the Caribbean, and even sharing the traditional Indigenous name of Jamaica, right? And understanding like that's the anglicized version of Xaymaca. And when I'm also from an island, it's the anglicized version is Karaku, but the traditional word for it, which is Heri Uaku, which means the place of many reefs. And so we still carry Indigenous names of places in the Caribbean that we oftentimes don't know that we're still speaking Indigenous languages, Arawak, Taino, Carib, Garifuna, Maroon, right? Languages that have been formed that we don't even realize we are speaking Indigenous languages when we talk about the places that our ancestors called home. And as you were talking about displacement, I always say I'm someone who's triply displaced. My ancestors were displaced from Africa to Karaku, from Karaku to Trinidad, and then from Trinidad to Canada. And what it means to be multiply displaced from land, and to constantly having to try to find home and connection to places that oftentimes alienates us and makes us feel like we don't belong. And just the beauty of African descended people creating these communities and these places and these cultures. The Caribbean went through ethnogenesis. We are African Indigenous people displaced from our homelands who have created distinct cultures and languages and communities through that survival and that resiliency. And so even when we're talking about connection to lands from the places that our parents or grandparents are from, or even we're born in, and then coming to Canada, there's a deep rooted connection to land through that resiliency. And I oftentimes think about the Gullah Geechee people in the Carolinas of the United States, and how after the Civil War, they used ceremony, African Indigenous ceremony, to heal the land after all of that violence and death on those lands. And so there is a deep connection that we build even on lands that we are not from, on lands that we have been forcibly brought to, on lands that our blood has been seeped into through resiliency, through resistance, and even through oppression. And that connection is so deep rooted, even in our connection to our ancestral lands in Africa and the ways in which we do it. And so I just want to say thank you so much for the story you shared and how you articulated it, because I think it beautifully connected that. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. So we're going to get into our conversation today. And I think Djenabé's story was the perfect start to this conversation that we'll be having. Today, we're going to delve into the intersection of Black ancestral knowledge with food justice, culture, and Indigenous ways of knowing. From the Maritimes to the prairies, our speakers will highlight unique narratives and the relevance of Atlantic displacement to Canada's, or so-called Canada's, political ecology. So this journey that we are going to be embarking on together, and I say this together as a collective, the folks that are speaking, the folks that are witnessing, we are going on this journey together. It will reveal the deep connections between climate change and Black communities' ties to land, labor, and ancestry. So I would like to bring attention to our panelists now, who will do a deeper introduction to themselves, because I know how awkward it is sometimes for someone to read your entire bio and then you go to introduce yourself and you're like, what do I say? So I want to give you the opportunity to articulate to folks who you are from your heart and from yourselves. But we have Tyjana Connolly, Radia Mbengue, and Jacqueline Dwyer, and I'd like to invite all of you to come off mute now, to come on camera if you aren't on camera, and to come into this space to share with the rest of us. And so I'll give folks an opportunity. Is everybody off camera or on camera now? Just want to confirm.
Yep.
Yep. Okay, awesome. So we're going to get into it. So the first thing that I'm doing is I'm going to ask for you to introduce yourself and the work you're doing and why this conversation is important to you today. So Tyjana, would you like to go first?
Sure. I introduced myself a little bit, but I guess I can go a little more in depth. I do want to even talk about like my background and being like someone who has Jamaican heritage, and how being in this work and being in this sector is deeply connected to that. And I've even found that my work through Black Eco Bloom has made me understand like my Jamaican family, more specifically my grandma, and all the things that I have to learn from her. And the things that I do with Black Eco Bloom, I take back to her, and I talk to her about it, and I talk to her about like African Indigenous knowledge, and I talk to her about the knowledge she's carrying from the Caribbean and how everywhere she goes, she carries that with her, and she tries to put it into her life and give it to us as well. And I think that once you start really working on your relationship with the earth and working on your relationship to being on lands that are stolen lands, but then being stolen people on stolen lands, and thinking about that so deeply, it is a very complex relationship, one that I think about a lot and one that I try to put through with the work that I do with Black Eco Bloom. But I also find it to be very healing because it offers a lot of clarity on a lot of the things that I guess I struggle with in terms of like identity and place and community. And I think really getting into that conversation, and we're going to talk more about this later, I think it does really begin that healing process. So it's something that I do want to do more in-depth work in, not just through Black Eco Bloom, but in my personal life and with my family and with my community. And when I go back to Jamaica and how I understand what my place is. Yeah. I don't know if there's anything else I want to share. I really, really, really loved the storytelling. I think it actually really calmed me as well. Like I was feeling a little bit nervous before, but the storytelling really grounded me, and that's what it was for. So thank you so much. And yeah, it also made me think about the communities in Palenque in Colombia and how they created their language Palenquero, and how everything that they I visited that community and how everything that they do is tied so intrinsically to the land around them, and even being able to practice their Indigenous traditions and being able to share that with their communities, and also being able to just have that space. I was very like touched by the fact that they had a community that was solely for them. Yeah, so that's where I'll stop.
Thank you so much, Tyjana. And I also had an opportunity to visit the Palenques, and yeah, just the connections also that I found in the way in which we honor our dead throughout the Americas where we have been displaced to. It was very similar to that of communities in New Orleans that I found very beautiful. So thank you for sharing. Radia, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. And thank you so much for this amazing introduction. It was really beautiful. I really loved the storytelling part. And also really thank you so much for having me and just for holding this space and yeah, giving us the space to talk about this. I think it's very important. So my name is Radia Mbengue. I'm born and raised in Dakar, Senegal. I'm actually right now in Senegal, so apologies if my connection is a little bit shaky. Yeah, I work in the humanitarian field. I specifically work on displacement and refugee education in Uganda and South Sudan right now. And yeah, this conversation is really resonating with me because I also come from a background where I've had the opportunity to learn about my culture, my tribe, which is the Lebu. So we are the fishing people of Senegal. And it just made me think a lot more about how it kind of moved from an aspect of our identity to now an economic means of living. So I think this is a great way to kind of delve more into it. I've had the opportunity also to work in the past on the gendered impacts of resource extraction. So working with local organizations in Africa on the right to say no campaigns to Canadian mining companies and kind of how it affects communities that are being displaced, and just the work of reclaiming our spaces, reclaiming our land and our culture, understanding what it means to allow these mining projects to come on our lands, and how to build up stories of resilience and really claim our space in the climate justice movement, because as it was already mentioned, that's a space where we're usually not really involved, or yeah, we don't really have a lot of presence. So again, really happy to be part of this conversation, and I'm looking forward to chatting more about this.
Thank you so much, Radia, for joining, especially from so far away. I think it's so important to have you in this conversation, and thank you very much for sharing. Jacqueline, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Sure. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So my name is Jacqueline Dwyer, and I am from Jamaica. I came here when I was 14 years old in this colony. We have, our ancestors were brought here, some of them against their will, and we dwell on the continent of the Americas. So I refer to spaces by its continent. Throughout my years in Jamaica, I had the privilege of being around agriculture and nature. And I was born in Kingston. So at the end of my school term, my grandmother would send me to my great-grandmother. And I have a different relationship with community relations and the land, because I actually sat with elders who gave me the knowledge. That's why I'm doing what I'm doing now. And so throughout those times, my great-grandmother, which was my grandmother's mother at the time, when she passed away, when she transitioned, when she left this space, she was 107 years old. And so just went to her bed and didn't wake up the next day. Taught us to always be truthful to ourselves, be good to the land, use the land well, and share the land. And so when I went to her place, she literally lived in a food forest. Her little house was in the middle. She had a hill above the house. It was fully planted, and below where her house is was fully planted. So I was exposed to constant engagement with birds, the fruits around me, the smell of the fruits, the smell of the soil, the smell of the trees, the leaves, and the resounding spirit of the people. And so always ate fresh. So my grandmother in Kingston was a trader, they say in Africa. In Jamaica, we say higglers. And so again, I was exposed to food all around me, and the power and the goodness of food and how it engages people and brings people together. So fast forward to 1978, I came here, and always traveling, learning about traveling and traveling myself around the 14 parishes of Jamaica. When I came here, it was a culture shock. It was a culture shock with people, way of doing things, the climate, going to school, learning about their traditions here, and being far removed from my family, my greatest network, and my friends. And learning how the food system here was extremely different from the one I was coming from. And at the time, it was much, much better than it is now. Farmers were growing abundantly. They were happy to grow and get their produce in the market. Food was affordable. It was accessible. It might not be a lot of the cultural food I was used to, but I remember when I moved, the first place I lived in Toronto, I just lived south of Oakwood Collegiate in the St. Clair and Oakwood area. And I had two neighbors beside me. To my right was the Italians, to my left were the Greeks. The Greeks were not friendly at all, but the Italian family were very friendly. And so the woman of the house would invite me to her into her yard and show me the fruits of the season and show me what they do with the fruits in their culture. And it was no different from what we did in Jamaica. Also, too, people worked for less, but they could afford to buy good food. They could afford to pay their rent. They could afford to travel. Now, fast forward to 2024, we are living in a dire quagmire. And so the earth as we know it, the systems as we know it have changed, and we are physically seeing them and feeling them. Some people don't know how to respond to them, but the earth will never die. Systems and humanity will die. The earth will never die. It will just replenish and renew itself. And so are some of the wicked systems in which we still continue to exist. We touched on a little bit of slavery, we touched on a little bit of gentrification, and many forms of dehumanization and oppression. And so those wicked systems will die. We can't hold them up. But we are living in a time now where it's a new time. And even the climate is telling us it is a new time. And it is a new time because we cannot continue to exist the way we are existing. We cannot continue with the suppression and the hate and the oppression and the marginalization to be the order of the day. So our food systems are going to change. How we trade are going to change. Continents are breaking apart. We're seeing that in real time. And our young people are more want to see change than anything else, but they don't have a lot of the knowledge of their ancestors, so they're still trying to figure it out. And so our old people are the keepers of the knowledge, and when we sit with them and when we learn from them, we learn how to do things differently, but we learn also how to be good to ourselves and this lovely planet that we're on. Since I started this work as one of the co-founders in 2013, I learned one thing about community food. I learned that irregardless of, where you place yourself on this life spectrum, good food always brings people together. Good food always allows people to share their story. Good food always allows for learning and contributions. And it also ensures that we keep our earth wholesome, well, and balanced when you grow good. I also learned over my 11 years that we were all birthed on the land, and somehow we are losing the land. We're losing the land in so many ways, and that has caused so many physical, mental, and spiritual imbalance. And it is very challenging and difficult to speak with decision makers to let them understand that the land is not something that we should be commodifying, but it is commodified. And because it is commodified, it is treated just like every other asset we have in the marketplace. And it is extremely difficult for us as a people now to have stable homes, to have access to good food, to be able to even go and visit our neighbors, because everybody is in a transient mode. And so coming to this meeting today, I was listening to the young folks. Maybe I'm one of the oldest ones sitting here talking about their experience, their journey, and their lives. And so yet still, we still have so much more work to do, because there is still so much inequality and injustice, and how we're doing it and how it's being rolled out, it's still not addressing the core issues, and it's still not fixing the problems. But I hope that as we continue to journey as souls on the planet, we pay attention to a lot of the things our ancestors did, and knowledge that were left behind, and continue on the path of, restorative work and reparatory work. Those are very key for me now and moving forward. And I also look forward in hearing what other folks brings to the table, their journey, and also their experience.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline, for what you said. That was so powerful. And it really brought me to stories of my great-grandmother. When my great-grandfather was off working, he would send money back to her in Trinidad. And my family jokes that when he came back, she'd always get in trouble because she spent all the money on feeding the community. So all the money he would send back, she would take and make these big meals and share it throughout the community in Arima that my family's from in Trinidad. And so it was like the running joke that not to send her back money because she'd use it to feed everybody else, and he'd come home to nothing saved. And so I really appreciate you sharing that, of how food often is also used as community work, as community support, as care, as activism. People, when they ask me what is community activism, I talk about what my great-grandmother did. To me, that's community activism through the sharing of food. And when you talk about your journey to Canada and to Toronto, I think about when I first moved to the north end of Toronto, and there was a lot of community gardens in the Jane and Finch and Sentinel area, and how those community gardens are now gone through gentrification, and how that's severely affected Black Caribbean communities in that area, but in particular our elders that relied on that access to food, to those gardens. And so I just want to say thank you so much for what you shared, and also about the work that we still have to do. Yes, we have so much that we've retained, but what are we doing with that knowledge that has been retained? How are we taking that knowledge to contribute to a future, and not even future in 10 years, a future today, a future tomorrow, what it looks like to live healthy and connected to land and to community now. So I want to bring us to our next question. And our next question is, how has the history and present state of Canada's extractive relationship to Black peoples and Black bodies, from forced labor and discriminatory industries to erasure from cities and public spaces, subverted our role in climate action and shaped societal narratives about Black people's connection to land? And so, Radia, if you'd like to start first, I want to give you the opportunity to answer this question. And then Jacqueline will move to you, and then Tyjana, lastly, since you started us off the last time.
Thank you so much. I really like this question. Like, as I mentioned, I'm very passionate about the relationship that the Canadian government specifically has in the extractive industry, and that has been the bulk of my work in the past years. I think it can really be seen and linked to the condition that Black and diaspora communities are experiencing here in Canada through environmental racism, gentrification, and housing policies, but also kind of a similar experience also in African countries. So my work in the past years has been really focused on looking at the government of Canada and really its role in the extractive and mining industries in a lot of African countries, from Ghana to South Africa to Senegal, and how it really created a situation where a lot of communities are displaced or signing documents that they don't understand or are not in their local languages, and kind of that gap that it created, because those are it's land and resources that have been in families for generations and generations. And because of the gap that now has been created with colonization, there's like a bigger gap when the new generations don't really understand the beauty and the importance of the land that we inherited from our ancestors. So now when we are receiving a check from a Canadian mining industry, it's really easy for people who are in economic situations that are usually very harsh to really replace that land and that connection that they have with nature and what they have received with a quick check, and really signing a document that they do not understand at all. So that's really the work that I've been focusing on in the past years, and making sure that we're empowering these local initiatives to understand what is going on, but also to bring light to the role of the Canadian government in this sector. The Canadian government has a lot of mining industries in a lot of African countries, but they also give licenses to a lot of foreign mining companies. It's really easy to get a license here in Canada and go and start extractive work in a lot of African countries. And in most cases, most of the materials are extracted or directly shipped to other countries. So it's not even creating labor in those said countries. So here again, it creates a bigger disparity and really encourages immigration. Like in Senegal, a lot of people actually leave by the sea. There's a lot of companies here also who come and who do not respect the fishing laws, for example. So we have a lot of people that are forced to leave to go to Spain. And every year, actually, there's a lot of people who die by the sea. So like I mentioned beginning of this conversation, my tribe is the Lebu who relies on fishing. So it's really interesting to see how we shifted from a relationship where the sea was an identity for us and kind of home, where now it's the reason why a lot of people die trying to leave their countries and trying to reach a better life. So it's really a heartbreaking story, but now it's also gives us light and on the work that needs to be done to call out the Canadian government, other governments who are involved in such practices, but also our own governments. In the case of Senegal, for example, we have a lot of reserves and communities that are now part of UNESCO heritage site, for example, where the indigenous communities that used to live in there have now been chased away from these lands. And before, they used to fish, they used to hunt on these lands, and now they do not have access to their homes anymore because now it's supposed to be protected by the UNESCO. So I think it also speaks to the own work that we have to do to call out our own governments and making sure that as a country and as a community, we understand also what we have in here and how to preserve it as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Radia. You remind me, there's a cultural theorist by the name of Brittany Cooper, and she talks about the racialization of time and how Black people are seen as outside of time. And then therefore, that is the justification to remove us from land and from place because we are out of time. We haven't properly used the land in the way that they feel that we should, or we're not protecting the land in the way that they feel that we should. And so we're seen as outside of time, and therefore, there's a justification in removing us from land, removing us from place, to be more in time with the ways in which Western world or European places see as how land should be used. And so that's what you reminded me of as you were talking about that, of removing people to put other things in place that are seen as, especially UNESCO, seen as more in time with where society and culture is going. So thank you for sharing that. Jacqueline, would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure. And so it's very interesting talking about, excuse me, extraction, colonialism, and the mother continent, which is Africa. Now, I just came back from there. I was there for 7 weeks in Africa. And I've seen what colonialism have done. And we talk about, we say the word, we say the term, but it's a very, very destructive term. Everything it touches, it destroys, it oppresses, it restricts. And as we spoke recently about Jamaica and Nanny of the Maroons, I actually went to her community in Accra, in a place called Nua. And those indigenous folks do not refer to themselves as Africans. They said Africa was created by the Berlin Conference. And so they are nobles. They still have their traditions, they have their practices, they're on their land, and they're still working collectively together to rid Naga, which they call Ghana, of these colonial oppressors. Now, colonialism has been extremely destructive. It has taken so much from our people and our lands. And one of the most sad thing about it, that people think that when you take and you run, you don't need to come back. You always have to come back. They go and they develop their own continents, but they never see it fit or beneficial to develop the continent of Africa and the people of Africa, but yet still you want to be there. Why is that? So extraction is another tool by design to build wealth for all these colonizers. And it's been a long-standing practice that have murdered, have raped, have plundered, have suppressed voices, have created new colonizers that don't look like them, but they look like us. And they're following those strategies in the same way that their colonial taskmasters trained them to do. And we're still seeing those practices on the continent of Africa today. We've always been living with that in the diaspora because we were never comfortable. We were always on the run. Our lives were always on the run. It was always in this fluid upstir that we can never control. And so when you start to mine, whether it's legally or illegal, you desecrate the air, you desecrate the water system, and you desecrate the land. And people were never given knowledge about your extraction practices. So now a lot of people are dying from drinking the water. A lot of the lands are rendered useless, but they still want to be there to extract as much as they can extract to go and enrich their countries or their corporations. What we have to understand as a people is that creation was created for all its existence, all its life existence. And its karmatic conditions are real. So whatever you sow, you are going to reap. And however you treat others, they are going to treat you in turn when it becomes your time. And we are seeing a lot of the practices in spaces like the Sahel region of Africa. I was there for 3 days. Those people are very entrenched in their culture and they do not want the present colonial taskmasters to be there, and they've asked them to leave and they don't want to leave. So we know that Mother Africa is the wealth and the crown of human civilization. We know all the wealth is there, and we know that a lot of the wealth and a lot of the minerals were never used to uplift and empower the people. So now they can use it to empower their land. And that's very sad. So I hope in this conversation, whether we're in Canada or we're outside of Canada, young people start to think about a better way forward in using these natural resources to build economies, to train people, and to invite African scientists to come back and use these materials now to develop Africa, because I think it's long overdue. We don't need to. Africa holds the power to feed the world as how the climate has changed. It has the world's largest youth workforce population on the planet, and it has a lot of, or most of, these essential minerals that are essential to building wealth. But yet still, we have all of this wealth, but many of us are the poorest people. How do we explain that? And why do we keep allowing this to happen and allowing these rulers who call themselves leaders to continue to stiff us out of our birthright? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I just love how you highlighted the power that very much is within the continent of Africa. And I think the way in which folks talk about Africa is this place, the continent and every country and community within it, as a place that is lacking, as a place that is needing, versus the immense amount of resources and power and just everything that is within the continent that we don't allow for that brilliancy to shine through. So thank you so much for highlighting that. Tyjana.
Yeah, there were so many things that I made notes about, but in the interest of time, I'll just touch on two main things. I want to talk a little bit about like Amber Valley and how it relates to this. And Amber Valley in Alberta was one of the first and only Black set. I think there was maybe one other one that I'm forgetting the name of, but one of the only Black settlements in Alberta. And it was made up of freed enslaved people who came into Alberta during like a wave of immigration from the southern states, and they came as farmers and blacksmiths, and they set up their community, and it was thriving. And in regular fashion, there were restrictions put on immigration for Black individuals from the states to come here, and so the province then became populated with non-Black bodies, and the communities that were created for farming and blacksmith and all of those kinds of things were kind of just like watered down and then destroyed, not invested into, not protected. And I just think it is indicative of like a pattern that we see across so-called Canada, because you go from that, you have Africville, you have gentrification, and then you also see like the policies that lead to migrant labor and extracting bodies from other places specifically just for labor, and then sending them back without any real meaningful like engagement to their development or the development of those nations. And so I think it signifies like what we were talking about earlier in terms of like a political ecology that we're seeing, in terms of like the state deciding what our relationship to the land is and what our relationship to the land can be, and putting that limitation on it. So I think a lot of people that don't have the privilege to grow up, you know, farming or grow up outside and grow up with a family that has that knowledge, they don't get to immediately make that connection that there is an important relationship there. And we're just kind of told about this extractive relationship, and we're told about the labor aspect, and it creates this dynamic where the land is commodified instead of respected and kinship. And so I think that when you start to understand that political ecology, it subverts that idea that the land is simply for economic means. The land is actually like a place for family. It's a place for community. It's a place for food. It's a place to learn. It's a place to decompress. It's like all of these amazing things that we don't really have access to a lot of the time. And then I know like where I'm coming from in Calgary, and like communities that are specifically or like majority people of color or like lower income, you have less access to those spaces and less access to make those connections and relationships, especially as people who migrate from their origin countries. You have to learn a whole new landscape, and there's not a lot of opportunities to reconnect in the way that you did in your home country. So I think that the state has a big part in that, and it's obvious to me that that's for economic means, and that's for making sure that there's a group of people that can continue to, I guess, like be the hand that does that commodification of the earth. So that's what I think.
Thank you so much. That was so powerful. And I love how you really touched on the way in which Black folks have been disconnected from the land as like a form of leisure and like even just enjoyment of the land because of the like sheer amount of violence in the forced labor. And even now, the sheer amount of violence of forced labor of Black migrants and in particular Caribbean migrants, and how that causes a disconnection from land, in being seen as something that there is love and care and kinship in. And so I really appreciated you highlighting that. Thank you so much. So we're going to move on to our next question. And our next question is, how can Black communities begin to repair their relationships to land and earth, considering that historical trauma and displacement that they have experienced? And what roles do ancestral knowledge and cultural practices play in healing this process? And Jacqueline, I'm going to pass that to you first to answer that question. And I believe Kieran will be putting the question in the chat, or I can as well, so that folks are able to see it. But Jacqueline, please feel free to answer.
Yeah. So one of the greatest dangerous legacies our people were given by the colonizers is Christianity. We're not Christians. And so because of that, we've lost our way in doing our spiritual work that actually balances the environmental system, the water system, the sun, all of it. We have no connections to that. We are just relearning. And that's a part of the reparatory justice I spoke about. Land rituals are very, very vital and important. And when we are not doing these rituals, when we're supposed to be doing them, we are bombarded with so many things that distracts us spiritually and makes our life so much harder. And of what I know at my age, nobody's coming to save us. We need to get back to our practices. We need to create safe space for these practices, and we need to do them on the land because the land requires them. And when the land requires them and uses them, our lives are so much better. Our day-to-day existence are so much more empowered. We're seeing so much high rates of mental unwellness right across the world, particularly with Black folks now, because we are displaced from the land. Again, it's not by accident, it's by design. When we, the people, the original people of creation, when you dig, our bones are everywhere. And when we were, again, displaced and disconnected from these lands, we have lost so many important cultural practices. So now for the young people that are into land-based work, it is always important to pour and to do your land-based rituals. Always, always, always remember from where you came, from those roots of your ancestors, what kept them and what have allowed you to be here. They were doing those works, even under duress. So libation is one of those practices that are very important and key. I used to see all the elders around me do it, and I used to just think that they're just giving the earth water and talking to the earth. But then after I got older, then they started teaching me the importance of pouring libation and always connecting our physical world to our spiritual world, always ensuring that we are connected to our ancestors, because we were given a religion that has nothing to do with us. It has only oppressed us in so many ways, and it has only created more dishonor in our souls. It has given us so much lack, so much downpression, that we now are still trying to create something on the run. So for me, I'm anchoring my spirit. I've always been anchoring my spirit, but even more so spending time in nature, inviting a lot of my community to come and spend time at my urban farm, and doing the work that we need to do for ourselves, because nobody's coming to save us. We must save ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And talking about that connection to spirituality, in Carriacou and in Trinidad as well, we have something called All Saints Day. And it's about honoring our ancestors and pouring out libations and going to their graves and offering food and telling stories. And you can't see it right now, but my altar is right behind me with my ancestors' photos and things that I've brought back from home and grave dirt that I have there to honor them and that connection. And so my family is a very Christian family, but they'll celebrate All Saints Day and they'll pour out libations on people's passing, and we celebrate 9 nights and 40 days. And and so it's interesting how even despite religion in the Caribbean and other places, how it's affected us, that spirituality and that Indigenous spirituality is still very much present. They'll never admit it, but very much present in the things that we are doing. Tyjana, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I don't think I have that much to add. I actually just want to really thank Jacqueline for adding like that piece about the spiritual work and the land rituals and paying homage to our ancestors. Growing up, my grandma, she's also very Catholic, but like for her, she doesn't see the contradictions, I guess, between the two practices. But growing up, we always spoke to my ancestors, and she would always like call upon them in times of pain and needing times of strength. And she calls on them to protect our family. And I think it's beautiful that, they're able to preserve that and see the value in it. And I think for her, it just comes so naturally to her. It's just what she grew up doing and understanding like the herbs and creating remedies and all of those things. So yeah, I just want to say thank you, because I really appreciate that sharing.
Thank you so much, Tyjana. Radia.
Yeah, thank you so much. I hope you guys were able to hear me, because I'm having some Wi-Fi difficulties right now. But yeah, I think I really appreciate this question and this conversation as well. And it just made me think in general about how it's important to us to make sure that we also understand that it's important to reclaim the fact that maybe our relationship to the land and to the earth was never broken in the first place. So moving away from the narrative that something is broken, because that's also really keeping us in a space where it's really hard for us to take the step that needs to be taken and also reclaim what we need to reclaim. But I also really, really, really enjoyed this conversation about our connection to the land through spirituality. Even it's making me think about like our own practices where we go to the sea to cleanse ourselves. Like you fully immerse yourself in the water as a way to clean yourself. And it's just making me think about how much spirituality and how much beauty it is in the fact that we go back to the earth the moment that we want to clean ourselves. And when we transition to the other world, we also go back to the earth. So that's a really beautiful connection that we really need to explore and make sure that we understand. And yeah, this really resonates with me right now, because I shared that I'm currently in Senegal for my grandmother's funeral, and just taking the time to also speak to your elders and understand their way of lives, and just this whole process of even using traditional medicine, but also understanding the connection to the land and how we go back to the land. It has really been like an empowering and eye-opening journey for me right now.
Yeah, Radia, I think we lost you a little bit there in the end, but if you wanted to type it out in the chat, anything that you wanted to add that we weren't able to hear, please feel free to do so. And I think I can speak for many of us in this space that we're sending you so much love and care as you're moving through this time of mourning your grandmother and honoring her and her history and her story and her journey. And so just sending you much love. And yeah, if you'd like to add anything into the chat, because as you know, I'm also dealing with internet connections. So yeah, just sending you so much love. Jacqueline, did you want to add something? I see your hand there.
Yes, I just wanted to say that the earth itself has two additional functions. It is the world's greatest pressure cooker, and it is the world's greatest recycler. And every time a seed goes into the earth, it brings new life. So think about that.
Thank you so much. Yes, this cyclical understanding of our connection to the land, right? It's never ending. It is constantly this rebirthing of new things. So thank you so much for sharing that. I want to ask one final question to our panelists, so that we can have enough time for folks to ask questions. And I saw a really powerful question in the chat. But my last question to the panelists is, can you share some examples or an example, as we're running out of time, of Black community initiatives that demonstrate the repair and reclamation of their relationship to the land that our listeners can engage in? So you can think of just one thing, because we're running out of time. And if you think of any more, please use the chat. But yeah, if you can just share, one thing, one Black community initiative that demonstrates that repair. Tyjana, if we can start with you.
Yeah. Oh my God, I have so many. Okay, I'll pick one. I think for me, I think if you're just getting started and you want to repair your relationship to the land, obviously you can start with Black Eco Bloom. But other than us, you can try Color the Trails, who bring people out into nature. So they do hiking, they do fishing, they do snowboarding, they do skiing. They do all sorts of things, and it's a safe space for BIPOC folks, and it's Black women led. And so Color the Trails, I think that's like a beautiful way to get started. And it's because it's also getting started in community. So you're not doing it by yourself, and you have the chance to like connect with people who are like at the same place as you, but also people that are further along in that journey. So yeah, Color the Trails for me.
Thank you so much. Radia?
For me, I think I'll just go back to the link I shared in the chat. Really amazing organization called Women, based in South Africa. They have a Right to Say No campaign where they go from community to community to be like, hey, this is what happened to our community. You need to be aware of it, and kind of making sure everyone understands, and making sure that women also involved in income generating activities to help them face the effects of displacement. And also translating all of that in their local languages, which I think is absolutely beautiful. And all the work that we do should always be translated into local languages so it can be accessible and that people can actually understand what they're talking about and what they're signing.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Free and informed prior consent is such an important thing when we think about the rights of Indigenous people and Indigenous people globally, which includes people within the continent of Africa that oftentimes don't get included in indigeneity when we speak on things like, the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and the calls to action. Jacqueline?
So at my urban farm in Downsview Park, we're right at Kill Street and Shepherd Avenue West. At the end of our season now this is our 11th year, we do an end of season harvest gathering where we come together and we break bread and we unwind in the lovely conclave of the trees, the birds, the grass, all the wild plants that surrounds us, and share food. And so it's become an activity that even if I'm not planning it, we have a couple of folks in the community that says, hey, this needs to happen at the end of the season. We look forward to this. As I just said a while ago, the earth gives us unconditionally. And so as a part of that unconditional love, we, the community, always feel so drawn to come together and sit down and unwind from being on a treadmill for 12 months of the year, to just share and to bring cultural foods and to make foods on site and to harvest from the fields and for folks to eat that and taste that and feel the ambiance in their palate, the power of eating clean. We don't say organic, we say clean. So yeah, we always look forward to that, and it's always a space that welcomes the whole family. And whether you're able-bodied, disabled, you are always welcome because the space is accessible. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Those all are amazing initiatives that folks can get involved in to learn more about. I know the links have been shared in the chat. So I really appreciate everything that you all shared. And I think something else that you can do as someone who identifies as Black or African descent that was talked about multiple times, speak with your elders. Sit down and ask them about their relationship to the land, to the medicines and the herbs that they have used, either traditionally where they are from or the herbs and things they use now on these lands. My grandmother's always yelling at me to bring back mango leaves every time I go down to the Caribbean. But take the time, sit and listen with them, ask them questions, because they say when one person passes away, it's the equivalent of burning 100 libraries. And so really take that time to talk and listen and hear those stories. I know we have about a couple questions in the chat. So I want to give us an opportunity for folks to answer a couple questions. I know there was one that was further up, but someone had asked, how are we able to respect the agency of African leaders and communities choosing to sign deals with international mining companies, not assuming that former colonizers forced them to? And so, Radia, I don't know if you would like to speak to this, because you spoke a lot about especially the relationship to mining in the nation and communities that you're from.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's actually a great question, because we don't always want to go towards that assumption. And it actually made me think of the fact that I did meet communities in my work in Ghana that shared with me that they're actually not opposed to these mining projects. Like, that's actually something that they're welcoming, because in some of the zones that they live in, it's really harsh conditions. And they're definitely not opposed to it, but the main problem is that they're not actually being involved when it comes to, the extraction or even whatever resources or money that comes out of it. Like I said, most of the times it's extracted, it's refined elsewhere. So I think it's an important work where we just need to make sure that these communities are consulted before, give their consent, and really understand the implications of mining, and that they're also involved in deciding where these projects are going to take place. But there's actually a lot of work that's being done on the continent where a lot of organizations do that work. So I'll share in the chat the link to an organization that I also worked with in the past. It's called All Watch Africa. And I worked specifically with All Watch Ghana. And they specifically monitor how oil is being extracted in Ghana. And Ghana is actually one of the, I would say, top 3 African countries that's really has a really good system to monitor how oil is being extracted and also the actions of its government. So it's really one of the only country where there's a really good civil society space where the government is actually really involving the civil society and being transparent. So every year there's actually a report that's being published on what's going on in the oil extractive industries in Ghana. So I think that this is, for example, a great example where communities are involved and are interested in extraction, but they're actually being consulted, and the government is actually publishing articles and bringing them into meeting and creating those conversations. So I think that's a great way to kind of make sure we don't always assume that they're against it, but making sure that the way that we go about it is actually taking care of the considerations of the local communities that live on the lands.
Thank you so much, Radia, for your response. I think, yeah, it's really important to ensure that when we're having these conversations about activism, that we're checking in with community to ensure that it is something that they have been consulted on and informed about. And so I really appreciate you sharing that. I just want to get to this next question, and we have about 3 minutes left. So actually, what I'm going to ask is if Jacqueline or Tyjana or Radia, I'm going to read out the question. If you can answer it in the chat, that way while I do the closing remarks, folks are still able to get the answer. So the question is, or actually it's for Jacqueline. We often talk about the gentrification that occurs within areas, lands that Black people occupy in Canada and North America. But what are your thoughts on tourism and real estate industries and how they become the most economically successful industries in the Caribbean instead of agriculture or fishing? So I'll give folks an opportunity to answer that in the chat. And Tyjana, Radia, if you would like to also discuss this, Radia, from the perspective within the continent of Africa. But I just want to give folks the opportunity to respond to that question. But I just really wanted to say thank you so much to our panelists today and those that were asking questions in the chat and also sharing their own stories, for being so vulnerable and open and honest and direct about their connection to land as people of African descended people, of African people, Black people, Caribbean people. We don't get included in this conversation almost ever. And it's so important that we create spaces like these for us to have these conversations, to talk about our relationship to the land, what it means, the history of it, and how we have grown to create deeper connections to the land, even in places that we aren't necessarily from. And so I just, again, want to say thank you so much. I learned so much from this conversation. I know folks that are listening have probably learned so much from this conversation. Yeah, just want to say thank you, thank you, thank you. I know we have a feedback survey that will be going out to folks, so if you can please respond to the survey. I know it never feels like we have enough time in these conversations. We probably could have done a 6-hour conversation and still not have had enough time to go through these questions with all of the wealth of knowledge that's here. But again, thank you, thank you, thank you for our storyteller, for our panelists, for our witnesses in this space. Thank you for being in community with us. And I want to wish you all a good rest of your day. And I hope this filled your soul as much as it filled mine. So, Chimigwich, thank you, Marcy.